Don't worry, I'll be quiet for now.
Yeah.
It's okay.
Alright. We already do intros, or do we want to do?
No, that'd be helpful. Thanks.
Yeah. First speaker for side government can be Xander Deutsch from Menlo-Atherton.
Second speaker is going to be Sean Kumar. Same pronouns.
From side opposition, my name is Adrian Chekchev. I'm going to be the first speaker.
My name is Josh Monflosky, and I'll be the second speaker.
Alright. This is super weird, but is it okay if I sit down while sitting on here?
Yeah.
Alright. And then our judges are okay with off-time maps.
Yep.
Alright, I'm gonna be doing some problem case work, 2 advantages, and an underview. Alright. Is anybody not ready? My time begins in 3, 2, 1. On the topic, this house regrets the existence of private collections of culturally significant art. The first thing to note is that this is a policy round indicated by the plan, because if you do regret something, you would actually take steps to live in a world without it. Thus, we take steps to abolish this because we think that it's inherently bad. So you might be asking then, what is the plan? The plan is the USFG will abolish private ownership of culturally significant art through public acquisitions. The actor is going to be the USFG, this house is going to be the United States. Time frame is going to be as soon as possible, and the funding is going to be through public arts committees. And normal ways and means. We see that the mechanism for this is going to be a combination of mandatory public purchases, long-term institutional loan mandates, and legal restrictions on future private acquisitions in general. And then just some definitions work here. We see that culturally significant art can be determined by public arts committees, but also we see that this is this is more generally things that are symbolically or historically relevant towards an actual country itself and the national history that it has. Then we see that private collections are held up by individuals, and most importantly, not accessible to the general population on a daily basis. So this means while private museums are technically exempt from this if they do show their art towards the general public at most of the time. And then that said, the way mechanism for this debate round is going to be general util, as we're evaluating how this generally applies to the most amount of good for the most amount of people in the United States. That said, let's move to the advantage number 1, which is that of cultural access. I repeat, cultural access. And the thesis of this is that art belongs to everybody, not just the elite. The uniqueness number 1, most iconic art is locked away in private spaces. We tell you that over 80 to 90% of known artwork that remains locked up in private ownership and not actually in public institutions. We see that many are kept in private vaults or houses, never to be seen by the public. The second point is access depends on wealth, right? The values, it values whether you live in a wealthy city or you have connections to collectors, and if you don't, then you will never see or experience these pieces of art and the significance that they actually hold. The third point is public museums can't compete financially. Yeah.
Will you be taking away art that currently is in private collections, or will you only be stopping future acquisition?
Yeah, so going back to the mechanism is these public arts committees will buy up existing art at a fair valuation, and then they'll be putting it into public institutions.
And regarding new art to be produced or to come?
And new art to be produced will face restriction on future private acquisition per the mechanism.
How do you determine if it's culturally significant if it has only been around for so long?
Public arts committees will deal with that determination.
Okay.
Time continues in 3, 2, 1. The third point here is public museums can't compete financially, right? This idea is that private collectors often outbid national institutions, driving up prices and stripping public access to cultural heritage. The links is number 1, works become transferred to public museums, right? We see that the artists reclaim through fair acquisition and other mechanisms. The second point is that rotating exhibits ensure wide regional access. We see that this leads to an inclusive access regardless of geography or actual status within the community, meaning regardless of your wealth, you're able to get access to these significant pieces of art. The third point is public curation ensures education. Art will be tied to school programming, not just actual private aesthetics or what a private family is able to do with it. The fourth point here is that of public art democratizes memory. We see that when people actually see their cultural history in these shared spaces, they feel connected to it inherently. And the fifth is that of national identity becomes collective, right? In our country, we see that we can see that the reflections of art and how it actually impacts our own legislation and actually how public. Yeah.
Can you just give me your second link for this?
The second link?
Yeah, between ties to schools and work transfer to public museums.
Wait, my bad. The second one is rotating exhibits ensure wide regional access.
Great, thank you.
Yep. Are we good to continue, John? Time continues in 3, 2, 1. And the fifth link is that of national identity becomes collective, right? We see that in our world, we can see the effect that art has over our country through that of protesting and just public narratives in general. Now we look at the impact level. The impacts are threefold. Number one, millions of people actually see this iconic artwork. Why does this matter? It means that quality of life goes up as you're able to enjoy more things and more attractions and more art in general. The second thing is that if art education also goes up, we see that there's immense value in art, and people being able to get exposure to that generally leads to better outcomes for them, and they might actually pursue careers in that art. And then the third is that culture becomes public, right? We see that like it's actually not going to become private, and in fact the cultural history and the cultural makeup of the people within our history are going to become public towards everyone to see. The advantage number two is that of historical justice. I repeat, historical justice. The uniqueness for this is multifold. The first off is that art sells under unequitable power dynamics. Many creators sold works under like colonial rule, financial desperation, or systematic racism as they had to get their work out. The second point here is wealth disparity. Historically, only the rich had the power to collect, meaning the cultural narrative has always been shaped by elite taste, not actually democratic access. The third is cultural erasure. Communities lose their identity. This is important. This is like important national and ethnic work that sits far away, and it leads to cultural disconnect and discrimination. You can look at an example of this of like, for example, many like, if you actually watch like the Black Panther, you can see that in the Black Panther, like the first scene is Michael B. Jordan going in and literally stealing back art that was taken from like tribes and now held privately in other countries, which is an example of how like this racial discrimination and colonialization has led to terrible outcomes.
Do I?
Yeah, sure.
Many famous art museums, including the Louvre in the UK, many museums are all famous for using their colonial advantages to collect art from countries like Egypt and various African countries. How are you any better in your world?
Yeah, we tell you that while these instances are actually going to stay the same, there are many private collectors who take this art and store it away because they understand they get pushback since it was made colonially, and by making it public, we actually do a better job of that. And like, again, pushing it into the public spotlight means more people are going to see this and notice the harm and then push for it through policy. So like people are going to see the art and then push for policy. The link to this is the plan restores culture to its rightful public context. Number one, it reclaims. It corrects for historical sales, whether exploitation, poverty, or colonial pressure. The second is center communities are not collectors, right? Are not collectors. Like art gets returned to museums, it represents culture. The third is it signals morality. The plan shows a clear line. It justifies by making public what was stolen. The impacts are threefold. Number one, it's restrictive for wrongs. Number two, it empowers culture. And number three, it prevents the loss of meaning. Okay.
You can expand on that a little bit. You're like.
Okay, basically, the underview to this argument is basically this idea that even the solvency for-side government in this argument is the idea that people are going to see these art that was repressed from people. And let's say this was like work from Zambia that's now being held in the United States. Since everybody can now see it, they're now going to say, wait, it's really messed up. We need to give it back to Zambia, for instance, and then they're going to be able to protest for it. But right now it's locked away in a vault, so people don't actually have the mechanism to protest against it and actually stop this cultural erasure that goes on. Therefore, that's like Aft's inherent solvency here. Then let's move on to, then we're going to move on to like an underview here. We see that generally MG theory is going to become over all LOC theory and all pre-fiat impacts and post-fiat. The first thing here is time skew. The PMR has no way to cover everything needed to win, even with golden turns after the 12-minute block. The second point here is strat skew. The neg speaks in the dark while the AF can adapt. The AF speaks in the dark while the neg can adapt to the AF on different levels of the flow, such as like discursive arguments or critical arguments. And so we think that because of this, you always evaluate MG theory first. Overall, I would a strong vote for side government in this round. Thank you.
What? Okay. If anyone is not ready, let me know. If any judges need any other info, I don't really know what else that would be, but. Okay. If not, I'll start my time on my first word. So I'm gonna start off with some framing. I think that on our side of the house, like, we don't need to prove that like every single private art collection that exists is good. Like, I think we can probably bite there are some private collections that aren't good. But what we have to prove is that there's at least some subset of cases where private collections are good and a thing that shouldn't be abolished. And specifically here, we're going to say that, those collections where the artists freely sold their art into this collection are those collections which we think are perfectly legitimate and should be allowed to exist. So obviously that contradicts with their plan, which is to sort of get rid of all of them. That being said, the first contention here is actually going to be on principle.
Time.
Yeah, what's up?
Wait, so is the neg central advocacy are you defending specifically an advocacy in the round? Like, what are you?
I think our advocacy in the round is that all private collections that where the artist freely sold their art into the collection should be maintained.
So it's like a counterpoint almost.
Sure.
Okay.
Okay. Our first contention here is on principle. Note that this explicitly contradicts with their whole utilitarian framework. I think this is perfectly fine. They don't really give you any analysis for why we should care about util, and I think that especially as the government, you actually do care about principle things. For instance, we could arrest someone who is ostensibly innocent but likely to commit a crime, and maybe that would lead to utilitarian good because it would prevent them from committing this crime, but the government doesn't do that because it believes in principles like rule of law. So clearly the government cares about things other than just pragmatics, it cares about principle. That being said, what are the principles here? First of all, we think that the purpose and usage of art are properly determined by the artist. Why is that? First of all, we think that if anything else was the case, then artists wouldn't create art that only they see, which is to say the fact that artists create art which only they see indicates that the primary value that they get out of art is their own expression, not, that consumers looking at it. Second of all, we think that things you produce must fall into your possession. We think there's no other way to determine the possession that someone should have, and this is basically just a basic extension of property rights. You create something, you have a right to it. But third of all, we think that insofar as art has sort of transcendent aesthetic value, we think that the artist is the only one who can fully understand it, which is to say that if we went to Mars and found art, we wouldn't be able to fully understand that art because we wouldn't be able to understand the intent with which it was created, which is a constituent part of that art. On the other hand, the artist is the only one who fully has access to this, which means that they should have full sort of control over the art and the way in which it is used, right? So why is this important in the round? We think that the artist should be able to choose what they want to do with the art and whether they want to sell it privately or whether they want it to be publicly owned and displayed, not some public arts committee in Washington, D.C. that they give you. So for instance, maybe you're some artist in the U.S. that creates, art that expresses your hatred of the U.S. or hatred of certain U.S. policies or maybe hatred of public arts committees. And then after you've created this art, you're like, wow, I'm satisfied that I've done this. Now I want to make some money. I think the best thing I can do with this art is sell it. But then on their side, you're actually not, no thank you, you're not able to actually determine what you want to do with that art because instead some public arts committee just does it. The second point here is just on agency as a whole. We think that people ought be allowed the agency to decide what to do with the things that belong to them, and we think that's something that they fundamentally get rid of. We think that when you as an artist create something, you should have a right to how you use it. We think that agency is something that is just sort of a priori good here. We think it's an extension of innate human dignity and bodily autonomy to be able to do as you like. And we also think that since the individual can best determine for them what will say make them happiest, agency actually prerequisites utilitarianism, which is to say that you need to allow people the capacity to choose what will best make them happiest in order to then have utilitarianism. But then if you don't buy that, getting onto the prag, first of all, we're going to talk about the preservation of art within private collections. So first of all, we're going to say that museums and generally things the government does tend to be super underfunded. Why is this especially likely to be the case with this art? First of all, we think there's a pretty clear political incentive to at some point in the future cut funding for art or for the museums in which it's displayed or whatever, which is just to say that hey, if you cut welfare, there's a very clear backlash that's going to happen. On the other hand, if you cut funding for the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the bougie New Yorkers who are going to be annoyed by that aren't going to be a substantive threat to your political career. And we think that this especially happens given the case that they give you, because we think that hey, when you buy all of this art from private art collectors and they tell you that 90% of art is owned by private art collectors, think about just how expensive that's going to be. When single pieces of art sell for hundreds of millions of dollars, think about how much money the government's gonna have to spend to buy all of this back. Well, we think this means that you're gonna get huge backlash on their side to the amount of money the government is spending buying this art. And as a result of that, there's going to be less political capital to do things preserve this art well. We also think that we've seen that demonstrators often target public art, whereas there's no incentive to target private art, which we think means that art is much more vulnerable on their side. This is obviously a prereq to all the values they give you about why art is good and whatnot. We think that on the other hand, if you buy a piece of art, you know that you're going to want to preserve it because otherwise it's a waste of money if you buy a painting and then the painting just rots, right? Second thing here is on diffusion of art. This is really important. What happens when the US government says no one within the US can own art and this art all has to be resold? The art's just gonna get bought up by people outside of the US. Which is to say that if I'm someone who owns art within the US and the government is offering me a certain amount of money for my art, but then some like bougie guy in Amsterdam is offering me twice that cost, and they themselves tell you that private collectors are always going to be able to pay more than the government. What's my incentive to give this art to the government? I'm just going to sell it outside of the US, right? Why does this beat a lot of their impacts? First of all, hey, there's no art in the US anymore, so like any impacts they give you, like, oh, like the people see the art and they realize something. Like, no, there is no art. The only people who can now see this art are the people who can afford to like fly to Europe and like see some gallery in Copenhagen and then, you know, appreciate this art, right? But then the third thing we're going to talk about here is we think that like at the end of the day, all the claims that they're going to give you in terms of like publicly, you know, being able to see art, whatever, are largely non-unique for a couple of reasons. First of all, we're going to talk about that you can actually flow this as a response to their claims. I really think that probably makes more sense. And this is kind of just like maybe an observation on their case, I guess you could call it. So first of all, we're going to say that the way that people primarily interact with art in the status quo is actually not by physically going to see the art, but rather much more often mediated through things like the internet. And so we think that like even if art is privately owned, like I don't know, some of Picasso's and Van Gogh's paintings are privately owned, but we can still actually, you know, like commune with them because they're accessible via the internet. But then second of all, we're going to say that it's unclear what the benefit of having 1,000 paintings versus 3,000 paintings where the other 2,000 paintings are like, you know, locked up somewhere in the basement are. We think that there's like a very small actual like good thing that comes about as opposed to, you know, when you get like that much more art, because we think that like most people can't, you know, consume and view and think about all the art that's publicly displayed anyway, so they don't actually have a huge delta. What do I want to talk about on their case? First of all, in terms of cultural access, they said most art is locked up. You feel a connection when you see it. You can kind of cross-apply a lot of this. In terms of historical justice, they say that a lot of art is sold under bad or unjust conditions. We also think this is a bad thing that happens, and we can also say that like the government should reclaim art that was sold under, say, coercive conditions, so that you can just wash this out of the round. Then they say that like the perception of art is shaped by elites. What are they doing? They're giving some like elite bureaucrats the power to decide what art is cultural and what isn't. They don't solve for this. If anything, they structuralize the fact that like some elites get to decide what is good and what hasn't. What happens on our side? You're a private collector, you buy some art. When you're about to die, you realize this art is culturally significant, and you say like, donate it to a museum or something like that. We think that the ability for the public to decide what's good art and what isn't is much better preserved on our side. Finally, in this whole theory about how you like prioritize NG theory, like I don't know, like get good guys, like both sides of the debate are kind of like equally good. We think that like, yeah, sure, op can like say a bunch of stuff, but also like it's asymmetrical because I don't have the time to both give a 7-minute case and respond to everything that you guys said, and you guys have the last say, so it's not as though like there's no skew towards government whatsoever. I think both sides have their own unique advantages. There's no reason to outright prioritize one side over the other. For all these reasons, really couldn't be prouder to oppose here.
Awesome. Order is 2 off. After neg.
Do you want to say
Yeah,
okay,
okay. Or actually, we're going neg now. 2 off. After. No, neg then after.
Anyone have extra paper?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you want a long?
I don't care. Just I mean, two off. Sorry.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks. Oh, that's funny. Thank you.
Slow and clear me as needed. Brutal POIs are great.
Or use PSs.
Or use PSs, whatever you want.
What was order again? Sorry, two off.
2 off, neg then out. I mean, I guess I'll do 2 off, hit the framing a little bit, neg then out. Time is beginning of my first word. We think there's a lot of problems fundamentally with the negative side and how they choose to defend an advocacy. A, interpretation. Throughout the debate round, the negative must only unconditionally defend the status quo. Throughout the debate round, the negative must only unconditionally defend the status quo. The violation here is we ask a POI, and we ask that we have effectively asked them like if this is a counterplan or not. They can see this is a counterplan. This is a direct violation to it, and they also effectively it's a pick. They essentially just take our AF plan and then they just subtract a bunch of stuff and makes it unpredictable in the round. We're under standards. The standard one here's on utopian fiat. If the neg is able to get access to a CP, they're able to get access to utopian counterplans, which means the app is able to never actually engage in the round. We say here that utopian fiat means the neg is able to choose ground that's really utopian for them. In this case, this has proven abuse on this shell because the counterplan, I'm like speaking in the same speed that Adrian was sort of. I'm just saying with more complicated words. But the CP that you guys read is proven abuse, because we say here that if you were to specifically look at the art that's done by like private ownership and the ownership specifically like historical injustice, and like first of all, we get no text for the CP. Well, I'll get into later on another standard, but the fact of the matter is, their CP, it literally solves for a lot of our harm to the advantage. They literally cross-apply their CP, say, drop their second ad, probably means we waste 10 minutes of prep because they can prep out a 10-second CP, probably not good in the round. Second standard here is ground. This is, yeah.
Which part specifically of our, I guess, CP violate are you saying is an unfair
Okay,
caveat?
so there are two arguments why I'm going to make that I was getting to. First is the proven abuse, which is that your entire CP means that we were prepping for the status quo, and now we have to prep for a CP, and your CP is entirely utopian because you can pick and choose ground whereas word defend by the topic. The second is potential abuse, because if you're able to reach CPs, you're able to reach CPs in any round, which means that like you are able to get access to really, really, really utopian CPs, even if you don't buy this CP is utopian.
You're gonna stay a long time.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Time resumes. Now the second standard here is ground. We say ground is internal to predictability because if, as I've said earlier, we were prepping for the negative being the status quo in the sense that like we don't know how many, there's an infinite number of counterplans. We can't even predict the number of counterplans. That means our ground is the affirmation was lost in the round. Yeah.
Isn't there also an infinite number of claims we could run?
There is an infinite number of claims you can run, but we are bound by the resolution. We are bound by a resolutional actor. We are bound by the topic. We cannot like go beyond the topic, or if they would run extra topical T on us, they have an infinite number of counterplans they can run. They can run agent CPs, they can run consult CPs, delay CPs, means that our fairness is lost in the round. The third standard here is depth education, in the sense that like you see here that depth education is lost because the topic writers want us to talk about the topic versus the status quo in a comparative, in the sense that they bring up a CP, our debate gets shifted. We now have breadth of education. We say depth education is always better because the topic writers want us to debate this topic for a reason, and without this topic, the topic committee would not write anymore, thus we would have no more debate. The fourth standard here is vagueness. There is no CP text, even though they literally say that they are running a CP. We say the CP is uniquely abusive because we get no text for the CP, and we get no specific actor or agent of enforcement or funding or mechanism, in the sense that they provide none of that to us. So particularly this shell is uniquely abusive. The underview. One, fairness. Fairness use evaluation means if you buy that like there's a direct link to fairness of any of these standards, you can just vote there because you can't evaluate anything else in the round. Fairness is an a priori condition to anything else. Second, education. Education is important. Look at our depth education standard, in the sense that they literally steal all of our ground by running a CP that drops our second ad. This is proven abuse, and say that like we aren't able to get education in the round because we aren't able to read our unique advantages and like compare it with the status quo. The underview. One, theories a priori, you're always voting on theory first to establish rules again before you play. We say that without theory, we say that like teams just go like 20,000 minutes over time, or they can like read like infinite nibs, or they can just like read a bunch of unfair arguments which make it like almost impossible for us to debate. The second argument here is that competing interpretations over reasonability is no bright lines of reasonability. Competing interps is the only fair model to actually evaluate debates round. Third, here is no RVIs. The RVIs are bad mechanisms for debate because they deter legitimate theory like the one reading it now. I don't know how they're going to respond in their next speech, but it probably should be like they have to beat this theory shell first in order to get an RVI. They have to like prove they're winning under competing interps. We say RVIs are bad because it deters legitimate theory, so there's no way to check abuse. And fourth, drop the debater. We say here that like just dropping their CP doesn't mean anything because like we aren't able to actually functionally engage the round. I lose 4 minutes of my speech. I can't even interact with the neg case in the CP because guess what? I've spent all this time reading this theory shell because there literally is no out. I was looking at Xander the whole time like what the hell do we respond to this? We probably say here that drop the argument is not sufficient the consequence because that means they can just drop the argument and whatever the status quo solves. Okay, next off. Interp, if asked, all debaters must accept and respond to at least one POI during each constructive speech. If asked, all debaters must accept and respond to at least one POI during each constructive speech. The violation here is that we ask Adrian a POI, he declines it. Standards. First is clarity here. We say that like POIs are uniquely more important than POCs because they allow you to interrogate, which means they're able to actually have a questioning line for that's not included in POCs. Second is moving target here. We say that POIs are really important because they create a model debate where you're able to question the other side. If you aren't able to question and ask the question to think you have the box, then debate becomes a game of memorization, not of critical thinking, which you say is going to be way better if you have POIs involved. Third is depth education. If we are able to interrogate the neg plan, they're able to explain it off their feet, which means that we have a better model of debate and a better form of education because that means they have to defend their positions explicitly when we ask them challenging and tough questions, which we can't do under POCs because POCs are not interrogative questions.
POI?
Yeah.
Do you think humans have the epistemic capacity to know of objects external themselves?
Yeah, I think that like humans probably have like the epistemic like capacity to respond to objects. I think I meet my interp here because I responded and accepted a POI here, so like I'm not really sure here. Okay, the fourth standard here is the parley uniqueness. We say here that like the parley is unique because they have POIs. No other format has POIs. You see format collapse and no one accepts POIs. We're literally just doing LD or like POFO at this point because their POIs are making like the parley so unique. You're able to question back and forth. A format collapse happens if you don't vote out on the inter. The voters just cross-apply fairness and education, specifically extend moving target and clarity to fairness because to education because extend clarity to education because you need to be able to interrogate the other side in order to create a better depth education, more critical thinking. Extend depth education to education and extend moving target and party uniqueness both to fairness. Also, like just cross-apply the other the T-shell arguments. We say that fairness skews evaluation. Education also they both are priority case layer because without these things, no one will do debate. Everyone will go home. Debate collapses. Underview crossplay from the previous sheet. Okay. Lovely. And then also extender. Yeah.
You said voter on the previous sheet. Just to clarify that. You said underview twice. You meant voter on one.
Yeah. Extend the voters and the underviews from both sheets. Okay. On the underview, yeah, just extend here that like they don't respond to Stratsky. We say here that they say like the app has like this is not going to matter too much, but just like if they read any pre-fiat impacts in the MO, this probably means that they don't get access to that because of time skew. They don't respond to the fact that even with golden turns, because you guys are flow judges, you have 12 minutes back to back to cram and spread out the app, which means we aren't able to actually respond. But second is Stratsky, because we have the first affirmative speech, we're the most predictable. They give really criticism and discursive arguments. We can't predict them. We don't know this, and so that means in any sort of round, so not just this round, we are inherently as staff at a disadvantage. Means you have to uplayer MG theory first of all. This goes drop it in there. Okay. Other contention one about principle. Yes.
Yeah, on the contention one about principle, just explain why util is probably the best answer.
Okay. There's a clear comparative here. Either private art remains in private art as like in which that's not they're not defending that world. They're defending the world of like the majority of private art remains private art, whereas like some of the private art gets bought by the government. You can probably see like those also proven abuse of leadership. I'm not able to actually like make responses here. But also we specifically tell you here that the Brink scenario, which we like, the scenario of the uniqueness here is that people aren't seeing art. 90% of art people aren't seeing. This is conceded. The status quo is not solving. That means it is a try or die for the affirmative insofar as they are, like for example, they're culturally relevant, like art is only as valuable if it's seen by the general public. So if it's rotting away in some private vault, we probably say we should try to get at least all of that. We should try to get so the mechanism for which they get their art, like the specific types of art, we should get art like all types of art. And insofar as like the art specifically held in private industries like aren't that good, like don't have like benefits like the average person, there's no value to this art. So if it's lying in private hands, it's not useful, which means that like it's the app is the only side that actually tries to incorporate all of it. Extend net benefits. Extend or add one here. We say like just generally like the uniqueness controls the link here. We probably say that the uniqueness is really really bad. The only way to solve this is like make all art publicly available. Extend add two here that like colonial rule and historical justice means that the only way to pay reparations is to go down.
Okay, this is gonna be quite a speech. Okay, I think the variation between Sean's speech and my own will potentially be the biggest interspeech trade-off you've seen ever. Wow.
Very good.
Yeah, I'm ready. Okay. Alright, so Adrian, can I have this? Okay. Everyone's ready?
Am I gonna need more paper? We're good.
It shouldn't be too much. I'll probably be
Do you
speaking
want-
out
do you want
half
some
that
more
speed.
paper?
No, I'm fine. I just wanna know if there's like new sheets or anything.
Yeah.
Okay.
New sheets we need to flow in.
Yes. I would say you did sheets as well.
Two new or
Sure.
alright.
Yeah. Okay. Great.
Okay.
Okay. So I'll start my time in 3, 2, 1. This is going to look like a whole lot of more casual response to theory than you were expecting. New perspective on theory. Let's see how this goes. First and foremost, the thing I want to note is that Shonik knows both Adrian and I quite well. We've worked with him in the past. He knows that we are East Coast debaters with minimal experience on theory. With that as the background going into this debate, let's now talk as to what exactly happened in that last speech. The first thing that the Gov comes up here and tells you is that, like, you should drop us because we run a counterplan. I have 5 responses to this. One, regarding predictability, they're running a plan on a this House regrets motion that is unheard of in the East Coast. I think there's nothing more unpredictable. This is the most principled motion I've seen in my entire life. It says this House regrets a certain occurrence, and they are arguing a quite literal plan as to what we should do in the future on a regrets motion. We think that, like, you should, to the same card, drop them for running a plan in the first place. Second response here is, like, our quote-unquote, like, counterplan is literally the status quo, because artists do freely sell their art however they would like in the status quo. We don't think this is a counterplan, we just think this is an observation. Third, and perhaps most importantly as to why this isn't unpredictable, look at the last clause of the literal motion. This House regrets the existence of private collections of culturally significant art, quote, even when the art was freely sold by the creators. They explicitly name our quote-unquote counterplan in the words of the motion. I don't think you can make this more predictable if you tried. Fourth response here, is that, like, you're at TOC, we'd expect that you've heard of a counterplan, and this would be in the realm of opportunity as to what the response you get would be. Fifth and final response here is that, like, the strongest claims on our side exist regardless of the counterplan. You can still cross-apply many of our claims, and they could have easily engaged in very strong discourse regarding the claims that we made, but instead chose to come at us with their responses, and I'll get as to why they've made the decision and why it's a bad decision to make in a moment. But first, let's now go on to their POI shell and our response to this. So, one, like, discourse, if they were truly interested in, like, discourse and depth as they claim they are, they would not present a norm that we have so clearly never heard of. Adrian and I have never heard of the norm that you should accept and respond to one POI in the duration of your speech. Why is it important that we haven't heard of this norm? Because if their goal was to promote actual discourse and actual discussion, again, given that Shonik knows we are East Coast debaters, Shonik would have come up here and said, hey Adrian, hey Josh, you probably should accept one POI in the duration of your speeches. We had no disclosure, we had no knowledge as to the existence of this norm, nor did we have knowledge as to the fact that this norm would promote discourse or depth. Therefore, there cannot be an expectation that we follow this norm that we've never heard of. Yes?
Do I have to tell you to be on topic or to be, like, on time into the room? Like, what do I have to tell you and what do I not?
We think that if their ultimate goal is to produce discourse through a norm that we've never heard of and have so clearly never heard of because it is a norm that only exists on the West Coast, they should probably inform us of the fact that that norm exists. But say you even don't buy that, here's the second response. I tell you the norm is bad. And I know, according to Kevin's video as to how to prepare to TOC, like, this is a way to respond to theory. The norm itself is bad because you have 20 minutes to give your strongest claims outside of POIs. We don't think POIs are a necessary part of, like, active discourse, and if Adrian so believes that his only way to respond to that speech is to not take any POIs, that's valid, which brings me to my third and final response. Xander got up here and gave you, like, the most, like, intensive spreading I've probably personally seen in my entire life. And, like, we think it's very much valid as to, like, or at least prior to Shonik's speech, we think that it's very much valid to spend the entirety of your speech responding to a whole lot of spreading such that you have time to also deliver refutations and responses in the first LO speech. So, I think all of those responses are valid. Now let's get into my first attempt at theory of my own, which is like, they literally chose, or Shonik came up here to spread a bunch of theory that we've never heard of. I said, why are you spreading? Can you please slow down? We don't know any of these terms. And Shonik was like, I'm just using big words. We think that if the true goal of the government was to have an inclusive and depth and debate with depth, they would not be using quote-unquote big words. They would not be going this fast. If they wanted to present theory, and that is their prerogative, they can do so, but they should have done so at a slow rate that actually encourages discourse and depth, and not just continue to speed up while we were actively saying to slow down and just justifying it as big words that we've never heard of. Okay. I think that's all, like, the kind of, like, off-topic debate there. We think you should drop them because they claim to argue in favor of, like, depth and discourse. Don't tell us about the norms in reference. Say that, like, our counterplan is off-topic despite it literally being in the motion. And finally, spread using words and terminology that we've never heard of. Now let's go back to the actual topical debate, being the Gov plan and our own advocacy. Keep in mind that they spent no time speaking about the actual topical debate at hand, so assuming you are to at least wash out the points made, given that neither of us seemingly are super in favor of discourse, at least according to their claims and our claims, let's go back to the actual motion, the actual topic at hand. What are the flaws as to the Gov plan? Why should you be buying our advocacy every time? So first, my claim here is that, like, the Public Arts Committee is not omniscient. They have no ability or capacity, no mechanism by which to determine what art will be culturally significant in the future. a recent piece of art is produced by an up-and-coming artist, this like cultural arts committee has no ability to deem it culturally significant when it is first produced, because things only become culturally significant usually after centuries of having been produced, and only become culturally significant way in the future. What's an example of this? Like, very few people bought Harlem Renaissance art in the 1920s. It only became culturally significant in like the early 2000s when people recognized just how much of a movement this was and just how important it was. Second reason like the Public Arts Committee won't really work is because they have no ability to like purvey like every single piece of art that's produced. There's millions and millions of pieces of art produced in the U.S. probably like every day, depending on what you consider art. You don't know what's going to be culturally significant, given that like a bunch of culturally significant paintings were made on a napkin in a bar. So like unless you're going to be going at every napkin in every single bar, you're probably not going to be able to determine what exactly is culturally significant and what isn't. So like assuming that most of their plan is referring to like retroactively looking at art that's been produced in the past and whether we should be buying that art from private collectors now, I have a few responses there. First are my pragmatic responses. 3 pragmatic responses. 1, limited government funding. The government cannot afford to pay millions and millions of dollars to each private art collector to buy every single piece of culturally significant art. We think that this is like also pragmatically like harmful because we prefer the government to be using their money on like actual important welfare programs and helping the people rather than just buying up random pieces of art. We think that you gain more from doing so. 2, we tell you that like less private purchase of art. There'll be less private purchase of art in the first place because they won't want to buy something that is ultimately just going to be bought up by the government from them anyways. Why is this bad? Less art is going to be produced on net, which takes away many of the benefits that they provide you because nobody's going to buy that art in the first place. Third response is like backlash from private collectors. Many of these private collectors are very wealthy and very powerful people in the country. These people will either go elsewhere or protest against the U.S. government, whatever option they want to take up, as a result of the fact that this government is just like buying up their art forcefully. Now, like, what are the principled responses here? 1 is like the artist agency is lost. Look at our C1 for that. We think we provide quite a few justifications as to how the artist loses agency when the government forcefully buys their art. But our second response here is like the private collector's agency is actually lost, and it's lost in 2 ways. 1, it violates like the free market principles that this like private collector has rights to. This private collector should, in theory, have the ability to decide what they want to do with their private property. But more importantly than that, we think there's a pre-fiat argument to be made to their plan, which is that it's an actual violation of the Constitution, insofar as you are forcefully taking private property from people at a price that you yourself are setting without any autonomy going. It's like the Public Arts Committee decides how much they're going to give someone just to take their private property. That's like a pretty explicit violation of the Constitution. Does that mean speed up or?
No, stop.
Oh, okay. Okay, so with that being said, now let's go on to like the benefits of our case. So first we give you a principled argument as to how like the purpose of art ought to be determined by the artist and not just bought up by the government. If they want that to stay private, or if they want to make it for a friend who then buys it from them, like they should have the agency to do that. Which is kind of like our second sub-contention there, which is just like ultimate like artist agency. Now onto the prag benefits. You have better preservation, better diffusion of art, and given that none of these contentions truly weren't responded to because we just heard a bunch of like spreaded theory that we only caught really half of, we think that you should be dropping that regardless, and I think our case stays standing on net. And with that, I urge an opposition ballot. Thank you.
List those papers there. Give me my water. Okay. I'll start my time on my first word. If anyone isn't ready, let me know. Okay, so I think that basically like coming out of LO, like Gov isn't doing too well on the flow, so then they end up running this theory, but I think they're doing even worse on the theory. So I'm gonna talk about the theory first, then I'm gonna talk about the thing. So first about this whole counterplan thing, like, I don't know, just to reemphasize a couple things Josh says, like, I don't know, I don't think it should be shocking that we argue for something other than the status quo. Like, you're at TOC, you guys know that counterplans are a thing. I hope your minds aren't blown by that. But then, like, I think just, like, gut check this. Like, look at all of the claims that we give you on our side, Judge. Like, are you really shocked by any of them? Like, are you like, wow, I can't believe an opposition team really ran this? Like, I just think you can just gut check this claim. The idea that they couldn't have predicted these, like, they're good debaters. Like, I think they could have done this. Then I also want to reemphasize that, like, what, like, our counterplan is really isn't that different from the status quo. Like, literally our advocacy is, like, legitimately sold art is, like, you can if art is legitimately sold, that's fine. Like, yeah, that's what the status quo is. If you willingly choose to sell something, that's fine, and the government won't intervene. I don't think our counterplan is even a huge departure. I don't even call it a counterplan. They're the ones who ask if it's a counterplan, and I'm like, sure, you guys can call it that. But I think this is just like very legalistic. I think that we're basically just describing the status quo in opposition to sort of what their claim is here. So I think that, like, you know, everything they talk about here doesn't really matter. But then also in terms of what Josh said, and here I'm going to try and kind of weigh this a bit. They run a plan on a this house regrets motion. Like, just think about that. The motion is asking us to think about the past, and they talk about what we're going to do in the future. Like, I think this is also pretty unpredictable, so I think you can wash out the unpredictability of both sides, and don't vote on one side over the other, just kind of wash them out. Then in terms of this whole like POIs or good discourse, whatever, first of all, you know, like when Josh, like as Josh tells you, Shauna goes pretty fast. I didn't really like the part of the discourse where he said that he's using bigger words than me. I personally didn't like that. So I think that, you know, as much as they're advocating for discourse, clearly that's not all they're doing. But then I'd like to do some weighing here in terms of the probability of good discourse within a POI versus without a POI. The claim here is basically that I, as a speaker, can 100% guarantee that absent a POI, I will contribute something to the discourse because I know what I'm going to say. On the other hand, I cannot 100% predict that what's going to come out of this POI interaction is actually going to be good for the round, which is to say that, like, they could say something that I don't understand, right? They could say something that isn't really related to the round. And so probability-wise, there's always a higher probability of you having good discourse in the round if you don't take a POI, which means that on the probability of good discourse, we're actually winning here. That being said, I want to talk a bit about the... And then also in terms of all this like strategy skew stuff, they say there's no responses here. I don't know, I spend some amount of time here at the end of my LO where I'm basically just like, yeah, like sure, there are different skews that both sides have, but like clearly there are skews that both sides have. And it's not the case that like one side has such a largely more massive skew than the other side that like you can't have a good debate on one side or the other. Look at the fact that like the win rate for both sides is approximately the same. Clearly their claim here is wrong. Yeah.
The argument of the win rate is the same and that like it's all the same is like new and also like wrong, but yeah.
This is actually not new because the claim that I make in LO is that there's no meaningful difference between both sides and that both sides are like have like different strategic advantages, but they kind of cancel out. I'm giving you an example of how this is true, namely in the case that both have the same win rate, and I think examples are allowed, but you can strike that if you want. It's basically the same claim as before. I have about 50 seconds left. I'm gonna unpause my time now. I wanna talk quickly about the case. First place you're voting for us here is on principle. You can pull through all of the weighing that I literally give you in my LOC, which says that the government is a fundamentally principled actor. Look to the example I give you here of why we'll never preemptively arrest someone, even if we think it could, you know, prevent a super heinous crime that would lead to very, you know, utilitarian bad things. But then also pull through the weighing I give you that agency is a prerequisite to utilitarianism insofar as people need the capacity to assign value to things in order to then derive pleasure for them. So agency is always going to be a prerequisite for utilitarianism. Agency also best ensures utilitarianism because like you yourself can best decide what will make you happiest. So if we give people more agency, they'll be better at deciding what makes them happy. So you're voting for us on our thing, but then you're also voting for us on Prague on this point of how all the art is just going to get sold outside of the US because it's literally a prerequisite to their entire case. If no one in the US can actually see the art, it's only the rich people who can fly to Europe to see it, then obviously they don't get any benefits. For all these reasons, couldn't be prouder to oppose.
You're welcome to use the stand if you'd like.
I was, you know what, I was actually gonna ask what alright, sick. I'm gonna do, just for some off-time roadmap, that's so good.
Collapse on your sheet.
Yeah, collapse on the what?
On the new sheet. On the new sheet.
On the new sheet, whatever that means. Alright. My time will begin in 3, 2, 1. The path of the ballot is simple. Structure is good even if you don't know it. You flew to the West Coast. We lose at like East Coast rounds because we know like a counterfactual or like because we don't know like a counterfactual or a characterization. Everything collapses structure because you don't know how to flow or you don't know how to flow. Right now, extend both MG sheets. Fiat extend competing interps over reasonability. They don't have a counter interp.
First extend competing interps.
First, extend competing counter-interps over reasonability. They don't have a counter-interp, so if there is marginal offense on any of the MG sheets, you vote there. MG theory above all other pre-field impacts means you evaluate it first. Extend this as an a priori concern. You drop the debater on both sheets. Then you can extend the interps on CP's bad. Extend the violation and how they just like tagline it. It's a deviation from the SQO. It's clearly a plan.
Respond to the fact that it's a counter plan. Like they tagline it as a counter
Yeah,
plan.
they tagline it as a counter plan. Therefore, they meet the interpretation by the.
They don't meet the interpretation.
Or sorry, they don't meet the interpretation. Then like, look at the extend the standards here. First off, utopian fiat, which literally doesn't get mentioned throughout the entire block, and this idea of potential abuse. That's it. Let's go into the response they have on this predictability standard. The first thing that
You can respond.
okay. The first thing they talk about is their East Coast and have minimal experience. Judges not excuse having poor form of structure within their answers. Therefore, we think that to the point that they don't have any voters, they don't have any underview on their own CP shell. You don't grant it at the same amount of ground. Also, we tell you that, or the fact that they don't do competing reasonability. Also, they're on a West Coast tournament. This is not East Coast. Therefore, if they came to the TOC the same way that they say we should know what CPs are, they should know what theory is. They then say that like that this is a plan on like this house regrets. You actually don't do that. We tell you that like this is something that like directly like Evan's stream does, and also like this is not abusive at all because we gave the rationale in the first speech because like we are looking at a world without it, we can just abolish it. They then say the CP is SQO, so it's not a CP, but this is actually again, if you look back to the violation, we tell you that because Shauna gets the POI and Adrian concedes that this is a counter plan or POC, this is a counter plan. Why is that important? Because even if this particular one they don't think is abusive, it opens the door towards CPs that have infinitely unpredictable ground, which accesses all of the voting issues and the underview that we get in our rounds, which has the implication of dropping the debater here.
Point of order.
Yeah.
I think the claim that like even if our counter plan is super chill, it like could ostensibly lead to other bad counter plans is a new claim.
This was said within the ammo. This idea that like, or sorry, no, the ammo. This idea that like the CP that this like the CP is actually the SQO, so it's like super predictable, and it's just responding to that.
Even better, this is just a potential abuse argument. This is just this abuse can happen in the future rounds.
Okay, looks new on my flow, but judge discretion.
Time continues in 3, 2, 1. There are other responses that you're in the TOC, so you should know CPs. In the same vein, you should probably know theory. The fifth point here is that you could have engaged in actual claim debate. We tell you that like we actually were not able to because you have this infinitely unpredictable ground. And you have this like utopian fiat like standard that's like very bad for the debate space. They then say that like you can gut check this, but we actually tell you that like because these standards were broken and because like this discourse wasn't enforced, we had a problem with the debate round. We were not actually able to interact with the claim debate at a good level.
Okay.
Moving down.
Yeah, wait. Extend these standards. Extend utopian fiat. Because the CP can be, but just explain the rationale. The CP can be infinitely utopian.
Yeah, the CP is going to be infinitely utopian because they have access to any sort of ground or any type of CP, which is inherently harmful. Then let's move to the...
And then extend the sports center on vagueness, because they don't have a CP text. So
extend vagueness. They don't even have a CP text. They don't even have an actor. They never provided us. Therefore, we have no idea what this counter plan actually is. It's infinitely evasive. This gives us access to our voter layer and our underview, which tells you to drop the debater here and actually doesn't lead to fairness. And fairness always skews eval. Therefore, you're always looking at the fact that they've ruined the fairness in the debate round, and that's skewing your evaluation. Therefore, you have to drop the debater on that. Then you can look at this idea of then you can look onto the POI. You can look to this POI theory. A couple of things here. They say that if we're truly interested in discourse, we would have brought up a norm that they know about. This is the exact problem. They didn't know about the norm. We think this needs to be in the debate space more. That's why we brought it up. This is like literally bites right into why we read the shell, because without it, they would have never known about it, and they would have known this is important towards parley debate and actually the education that they get. They said this is actually bad because POIs are not necessary to discourse. This is not true. If you look at the standards level, where we basically tell you of depth of education, and we explain this depth of education, this goes cold conceded, which tells you that POIs are really important toward the depth of education because they force you to think on your feet and have critical thinking skills. Also, you can extend the parley uniqueness argument, which tells you that POIs are inherent to parley. If we get rid of them, then we ruin the entire uniqueness of parley. This again gets us access into our voters layer, which tells you that education is the first standard, and education or fairness,
you need to extend the interp violation and underview of the shell.
Extend the interp violation and the underview of this, which tell you that since we get access to our voter layer of fairness, eval, then you're going to be looking at the underview here. Okay, now let's look onto their case, or onto their T on the speed. Couple of answers here. First off, they don't meet their own shell. They speak too fast. We say slow. They don't slow down. They don't give us any bright lines to how fast we should be speaking. Second off, we say that this actually this is like a bad norm because any debater, the counter like any debater should be able to speak as fast as they want. Even then, they don't give you any standards. They don't give you any voter. They don't give you any underview. They don't tell you if this bites into fairness or education at all. And just because they're East Coast debater doesn't mean that you grant them.
Order.
Yeah.
The claim that anyone should be able to rap as fast as they want seems new.
Rap as fast?
Sorry, talk.
This is responsive.
Yeah, it's a response.
That's the
I don't think this is responsive. I think it's just a new claim, but judge of discretion.
Sure. All right.
Yeah.
Time continues in 3, 2, 1. So we don't even have any standards to base off of. Just because they're East Coast debaters does not mean that you grant them any like less structure. And to say half of the same structure, and there's no standards here. There's no voters
everywhere.
What? Yeah, there's available resource anywhere. On the TOC, they literally tell you how to like you can do theory yourself. Therefore, we tell you that like there's tons of ways to do this. They say to drop us, but like we actually say that like this is not a good norm because they don't need it themselves. Also, POC is inherently solved. They could have just POC and asked for everything. So for these reasons, Judge, the first place, even if you want to look at their T, we see that there's nothing there, and then you can look at our 2 T shells, which are clean wins for F. Thank you.
Good round, guys. Judges, do you guys want us to step outside for a second?
Yeah.
Well, we can talk anyways. Up to you guys. I'm gonna need a few minutes though.
I'm gonna go fill my water bottle. This was certainly an interesting round.
Interesting.
I'm curious, do you guys genuinely? Yeah.
Okay, y'all can come in. Okay, so it was a 1-1 split, and I was the last judge of the tournament to submit my ballot, so I'll go first. Overall, I don't think that either team was very strategic in any of the decisions you made, and I was actually very disappointed because I thought that at several parts of the debate, both teams had a ton of outs, and you just chose to throw them all away and go with like the least strategic option. Maybe it was fun for you, which is I'm totally cool with, but I think you thought you were being strategic and you weren't. So let's go ahead. And the way I evaluated this debate is at the end of the round, the affirmative completely throws away the aft case, so I just have to evaluate theory. And I eventually vote for the affirmative from Menlo-Atherton on fairness impact of the POI theory sheet. So first I begin by evaluating the counterplan sheet, mostly because there was no layering claims given, but this is the sheet that had the most ink on it. That just compels me to think that it's the most important insofar as neither team layered the sheets and told me which one to evaluate versus where I started. I think the affirmative is far ahead on all of the standards level debate and the impacts. The problem is that I don't think there's a violation, and I go back and forth on whether there's a violation, and I consider how the negation explains to me that they're defending the status quo and this was not a counterplan. And I think it becomes very clear in the PMR that the affirmative doesn't even believe that the negation had a counterplan. And the specific contextualization where I make my decision on this sheet is that the violation that's extended in the PMR is that the negation taglines this as a counterplan. I think this is not what happened in the round. I think this is just false on face value. Insofar as if there's no violation that the PMR is going for, that means there's no offense from the sheet. It doesn't matter if your interpretation is a good one. If it's not violated, there's no offense. So then I go to the POI theory sheet. There's a lot that could have been done here, and this is what took me so long to evaluate the round. The affirmative kicks all of their standards except for parley uniqueness, and you tried to cross-apply your moving target and clarity of education standards, but the cross-application from a counterplan argument to a POI argument did not make sense. You need to make sure saying cross-apply is not enough. You need to contextualize the standards to the specific shell that you're reading. So you don't go for clarity, you don't go for questioning, you don't go for interrogating the neg plan, you go for parley uniqueness. So I'm evaluating parley uniqueness. The negation reads two counter standards. They present, the first one is that they presented a norm we've never heard of, and the second is that the norm is bad. I think the negation is losing that we've never heard of this norm, therefore it shouldn't be a theory shell. But I do think the neg is winning that the norm is bad. Specifically, the affirmative doesn't actually respond to any of the arguments that I don't know what you're going to read, thus I have a 100% probability of knowing I'm going to contribute something good, but I have an uncertainty that like answering your question, there's going to be some discourse that comes out of this. I think this argument was really good out of the negation. So this means I have a contextualized impact of fairness for the affirmative, and the reason why the negation ends up losing this sheet for me is they don't contextualize this, the norm is bad, to an education standard, and if you think that, I think that you're winning on education, but since you don't contextualize it, I can't give you the terminalized impact. The affirmative has the terminalized impact that fairness.
Quick question.
After.
Okay.
The affirmative has the terminalized impact that fairness leads to the collapse of debate. So they have a terminalized impact. I think out of the negation, what I really wanted to see is that it doesn't matter if debate exists. If you're setting norms that are really bad, then your form of debate that exists is bad, right? If you gave me this one sentence, the negation wins. And I searched through all the sheets to see if I could give this to you, but that's the work I would have to do for you as a judge. You didn't do it for me, so I ended up voting on the terminalized impact that fairness causes a collapse of debate.
What's a standard?
A standard is a reason to prefer an interpretation.
Okay.
Cool. Okay. I obviously voted neg. So TOC is hard, guys. We all know that. And I know in my paradigm, I'm like kind of between both worlds. I'm open to hearing anything. So I think it's equally boring for me to say that, like, you know, neg dropped because their shell format was wrong, and it would be equally boring for me to say that aft dropped because you guys ran kind of frivolous theory. I thought, you know, so I'm not going to do either of those things. Like, I'm just trying to be really generous here at TOC And I think that was easy to do here because I agreed that the round was messy, but there was a lot of good analysis layered in there. So I enjoyed it. I found it easy to be generous, and I gave good speech for that reason. They're not reflective of like good strategy, I'll say that, but I thought there was good analysis, so I go from there. Few things. First thing on all of the theory, I think Opt does a really good job of essentially responding analytically to all of the theory. Quality of discourse, the fairness of the norms. I agree there's no violation, in my opinion, probably on either of them. Well, sorry, on the first one for the violation, that's the next one. I think they're essentially doing competing interps in lay language, like they're constantly telling me why the norm is bad on both of these things. So they're kind of like living up to, I think, a lot of the requirements that you want them to. And I'm not going to spend too much time on theory because I think you handled it well. But for the POI theory in particular, I thought by the end it was just messy enough and there were enough responses. I really didn't want to vote on that, and I didn't end up seeing much of a reason to because of some of the reasons that I think the previous judge gave. So I can talk in more detail about that if anyone's worried about it, but for me there's just so much left of the case, and back to that idea of trying to be generous, right? I think strategically when it was a bad idea to go all in on all of this theory, and there's so much left to the case that hasn't been responded to, especially because we get a lot of really good arguments about why I should be evaluating the principle first, right? Why the government is a morally, kind of implicated actor here, why these things are a priori to me being able to even evaluate what good art is, and how we should be distributing it. Also, the Prague is like way too messy to even touch, right? Because I don't know what art's being bought, where it's going, why this committee is able to buy certain things or not, where how much is this going to cost. So for me, there's a lot of good quality stuff in the principle that just never got touched. And back to that like trying to be generous mindset, I think that's where I have to vote. So happy to explain that in more detail, but I think there was a lot of good stuff here. Just when you get into this type of TOC debate, don't go all in. I think it's just it's not going to be the answer. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Quick note for the app. I thought the case was really good. Okay, so
Yeah.
and
Really?
I thought you could have definitely won the
Yes.
case. Like obviously we would have needed to see that debate. I was impressed by the PMC and I had wrote in some like very nice notes. And I was like quite disappointed that y'all just decided to commit to the MG bit and it didn't work out. So, like,
Oh, by the
you
way,
should have
I have a
definitely
direct response to the whole like valuing art. Whenever we commission a monument, or take the Washington Monument, when they first decided to do it, they had to decide, oh, it's going to cost this much. That's not the same thing as deciding when a painting is